Draco Kravgi, a token of yesterday. Shade. Torvan Locke drove across a glittering field of shattered glass. His tank was a Vindicator laser destroyer of the Deimos pattern, dating from before Locke had followed his lords into rebellion. Then it had been commanded by Captain Osark Kaith, and the Brotherhood Locke fought with had been known as the Sundering Fist. They had fought the Emperor. They had lost. The Legion splintered. Locke killed Kaith and took his tank and his warband both. The former, Draco Kravgi, he claimed as his own. The latter he had renamed the Beasts of Steel. He had led them ever since, never once wavering in his commitment to the long war. Until now. It had been many years since Locke had relished life. He dimly remembered a time when the fires of vengeance burned within him. The centuries saw them dwindle to ashes, yet still he fought on. The gods demanded it. Locke was hunting, and that gave passable relief to his boredom. His quarry was a handful of Imperial tanks that had crept out from the Void Port the day before. He yearned to pit himself against the knights who struck and struck against his brothers, yet there were always other orders, always for less worthy targets. Tenebrous was to blame for that, all because of his damned holes in the ground. And yet these tanks still needed to die, and he was mollified that there was, as yet, no sign of the knights. "Duty is duty, and foes are foes," he muttered to himself. "Duty must be done, foes exterminated." At least this hunting ground was interesting. Sprawling across 40 square miles at the edge of Impresentia, it had been the primary transportation hub for Gothalamor Secundus, the glittering heart of a web of maglev lines and highways, covered over with roofs of stained glass. No doubt the corpse worshippers had gloried in the immense images of saints and primarchs, but they had proven no protection. "A flimsy shield of make-believe," Locke thought contemptuously. The structure had been visible from space as a scintillating lake of glass. Locke had personally seen that it was bombed during the first hours of the invasion. He had done this only partly to cripple the continental infrastructure. In truth, he had more enjoyed the notion of cowering Imperial vermin looking up to see their protectors smashed and cast down in razored falls to slaughter them. The image was almost enough to make Locke smile. The treads of his tanks ground through fields of glass. In places, it had melted in the heat of the bombardment, trapping burnt corpses and sections of machinery like insects in amber. In others, it formed colorful drifts, many feet deep, comprising a billion jagged shards. Human remains could be seen amidst them, flensed limbs reaching out like the hands of drowning men. "How many millions did we purge in the fire?" Locke wondered. The noise of breaking glass gave pleasing musical accompaniment to his thoughts. "How many corpse worshippers have died since in these lethal fields?" Locke drove by neural linkage. In Legion days, the tank had required a crew of 3. Now he alone was sufficient to man it and fire its weapon. The malevolent spirit that dwelled in Draco Kravgi's systems, a gift from the gods for his devotion, helped with other tasks. The laser destroyer never failed. Its power couplings never needed replacing. Draco Kravgi was loyal and fierce. He thanked Kar Gathar for that. Locke's hand strayed to the metal disc around his neck, another gift from an earlier era, pierced at the top for a leather thong he'd replaced 1,000 times. The disc was worn paper-thin by millennia of handling, the design on it long gone, though Locke remembered it clearly. A 3-headed serpent, the badge of a warrior lodge, long disbanded. It remained the symbol of his brotherhood with Kar Gathar, and so he had made it the symbol of the Beasts of Steel. Locke remembered asking Kar Gathar about his own medallion, long ago, when the word-bearer had been assigned to his grand battalion to foster bonds between the legions. Kar Gathar had grinned broadly and covered his medallion with his hand in a mock display of secrecy. "I cannot say," he had said. Locke received his invitation to join the lodge the next day. He and Kar Gathar had been friends ever since. A token of yesterday that still held resonance. So few did anymore. He grunted. Drool slipped from the corner of his mouth and pooled in his respirator mask. His armor was twisted, its plates rough with excrescences of bone and scaled metal, its lines warped, like they had part-melted and reset poorly, and beneath his flesh had bonded extensively to the ceramite so that he could no longer remove it completely. The same was happening with Draco Kravgi. Locke went long periods without leaving the driver's compartment, and when he did, he had to break the interface spikes. They were always repaired, regrown when he returned, ready to plunge into him anew. The tank was his body, Draco Kravgi's sinister spirit, the counterpoint to his soul. Let other Iron Warriors fret about mutation and cut their bodies. Locke sank into his changes gratefully. They were the gifts of the gods and were a balm to him, a reward for thousands of years of unrelenting war, and, he hoped privately, would one day prove a release. The character of the glass desert was changing. The bomb-blackened shells of structures emerged from the jagged drifts. The immense metal frames that had held up the roof were tangled here, curling overhead like the ribs of some carrion carcass, softened by the heat of that first bombardment, so that they had buckled and fallen down like talons to drive deep into the earth. Draco Kravgi passed beneath one of these spars, then into the shadow of a mag train hanging off an elevated track, where the mummified driver lay, shriveling face glued to the cockpit glass by a pool of tarry blood. Torvan Locke looked up at the corpse without feeling, and returned his attention to his tank's autosensors.
"My lord, grid sector 81 is bare of prey,"
came the rasping voice of Havok through Locke's helmvox. "Proceed to 82, Locke responded. Havok was his first lieutenant, and but one of the 10 tank commanders spread in a loose net to Locke's right and left. He could see the signifier runes pulsing dully on his strategic overlay, along with other sigils proclaiming possible power sources, potential movement, and other factors pertinent to his hunt.
"All vehicles, increase pace," Locke voxed. "These weaklings have already stolen much of our time."
He rounded the support that held up the maglev engine. Ahead, Locke saw a smattering of burnt-out relay towers, each several stories high. Between them, the glass was deeper, and here his quarry's trail was revealed at last. Something big had shouldered its way through the glass, ploughing a deep furrow.
"How do they think to hide from us in this?"
muttered Locke in disgust.
"I have a trail. Grid sector 88, he reported.
The lords of other traitor legions might have kept such news to themselves until they had secured the glory of the kill. The Iron Warriors still did things properly. Confirmation runes winked in his helm plate. The hunting pattern shifted, tightening and moving with purpose to enfold any potential foes near to his location. He heard the soft growl of other tanks approaching. He might not like any of the warriors that he led to battle, for Torvan Locke had grown to hate almost every living being in the entire miserable galaxy, but he still respected their abilities in war, and they were still his warriors. Locke followed the trail between broken buildings. Draco Kravgi was deep in glass now, fording a river of deadly color. If not for his indomitable tank, even Locke would have struggled to make headway without injury, yet the glass yielded to Draco Kravgi's passage, as all things surely must.
"As these damned corpse worshippers should," he thought.
They had to know they were beaten. Did they not comprehend what events they stood in the way of? The great rift had opened. The warp churned as Locke had never seen. And now, within the very bounds of the segmentum solar itself, no less than Abaddon the Despoiler had commanded Torvan Locke and his fellows to claim Gathalamor in his name.
"This is artful destruction,"
Locke grunted, scanning his tactical readout. He had said as much to Kargathar days before, as they had stood on the walls above the despoiled Saint's Gate and stared out over the blasted city. They watched the ongoing battle, listened to the crackle of lasfire, the chatter of autoguns, the thumping of bolters, and the roars of the warp-born terrors they had unleashed. Locke smelled brimstone, blood, and smoke. Once, that would have raised real passion. He had felt nothing.
"This is the Despoiler reaching out," Kargathar had said. "He is preparing the way for the end. It is the War Master, the true War Master, readying himself to do what the pretender Horus failed to achieve. And we, War Brother, are instrumental in it." "Yes," said Locke. "Soon it will be finally over, and we will have played our part, for what little that will contribute." He spoke not triumphantly, but wearily. He shifted his weight. His right ankle, boot, and greave had fused, giving him a lumbering cripple's walk. Standing for any time was uncomfortable. He had wanted to see Kargathar, craved contact with the one being he still held any love for,
But his mood had soured, and he had the urge to retreat back to Dracokravgi to brood.
"You are right to be humble," said Kargathar. "We are but the tools of the powers. We are blades to be drawn against the Carrion Emperor as the dark gods see fit. Never set yourself above the gods. As these mortals are nothing to us, we are nothing in the great struggle. We are proud weapons, but weapons are all we are." "Our purpose is at hand," said Locke, and he could not hide the yearning in his voice. "Patience, brother. You are touched by dark majesty. You are on the cusp of glory. Think not of death, but of eternity."
Locke smiled his crooked smile, felt the sting of lips tearing from the decayed interior of his helm.
"I think of nothing else," he said.
Kargathar was the only one who could see Locke's desperation, the need, the mania even, for the long war to finally be at an end.
"Stand firm," Kargathar said, "and remain steadfast. I know you wish for release, but the end is not at hand. Your reward is."
A massive impact shook Locke back to the present. The battle cannon shell was preceded by a sudden surge of power readings across Locke's autosensors, and yet he had no time to react. The shot would have blasted open a ferrocrete bunker. Against Dracokravgi's armor, it barely made a dent, glancing off the glacis and caroming upwards into a twisted spar. The shell blew, fire billowed over him. Dracokravgi's systems wailed, and the demon in the machine whined like a cur. Locke's head rang. He saw his attacker half buried in glass and plascrete rubble. His lassitude was swept away by a sudden, powerful anger. To be caught unawares by mere humans, and in a damned Leman Russ battle tank no less. Hardly a sleek ambush hunter. They must have powered everything down and sighted the shot manually, he thought with grudging respect. As the smoke cleared, he got a look at the tank. Its hull was painted off-white and banded with geometric blocks of brown. Urban camouflage chipped by weeks of warfare. Locke noted the streaks of fresh blood on the hull and turret, and the bloodied entrenching tools lashed to one track guard. His respect increased. The crew had disembarked into the glass to fill in their trail and hide their machine. Yet the tankers had revealed themselves now. All they had suffered up to this point would be for naught.
"Contact in my grid sector,"
said Locke across the Vox, preempting the questions of his warriors.
"Ambush attack. Single armor unit. Probable distraction. Adopt Beta Pattern 4. Lorgus," he called to his second lieutenant. "Be ready for flushed quarry and potential ambush."
"Yes, my lord."
Lorgus's phlegm-thick voice oozed over the Vox, but Locke wasn't really listening. Through supernaturally heightened senses, he could hear the frantic movements within the Leman Russ tank as its crew exchanged muffled shouts and scrambled to chamber another shell, and the gunners roused the spirits of their heavy bolters. He could smell their blood. His mouth watered. The praised claws were out. At least that would make the kill more interesting. Locke spun the tracks of Dracokravgi in opposite directions, bringing the long snout of the laser destroyer to bear. The Leman Russ shuddered as its power plant awoke. At the same time, the heavy bolters in its sponsons and prow mount roared to life, spitting shells at him with commendable accuracy, their impacts shuddering through Dracokravgi's armor and washing out the oral feeds. He powered the main weapon with a thought, driving forward to kill at point-blank range. The Leman Russ turret gun spoke again, but in their haste, the enemy crew hadn't depressed the barrel enough. Their shot whipped over Dracokravgi's roof and detonated behind him, sending a storm of glass shards in all directions. Still Locke advanced, and as he did, he incited the machine spirit of the laser destroyer to fire. The mind impulse link was still of technological derivation, but had been corrupted by its union with the demon, and Locke felt the weapon's half-formed excitement as it fired. He aimed for the right track. A blink of coherent light slammed through the armored cowling, blasting the metal cover to pieces and part-fusing the links beneath. Stung into action, the Imperial driver tried to move the Leman Russ out of its hiding place. It lurched, and the left track spun helplessly, making the tank shift to the side a little, but no more. Black smoke boiled from its exhausts. Glass sprayed everywhere. The gears ground horribly. The right track's drive wheels blurred around, caught and snapped the damaged track, which spooled off the wheels like a long, lascivious tongue. Locke lined up for the killing shot. The Leman Russ was doomed. A single shot would core the thing through and slaughter the crew. The laser destroyer was charged and humming impatiently, but Locke paused.
"I'll finish this personally," he thought.
The fight had shaken a little of his lethargy off and made him feel like getting his hands dirty again. 2 enemy signifiers appeared on his tactical display as the rest of the Phyroxian squadron sprang their ambush. By the time his warriors reacted, the enemy were moving, feigning flight from the more numerous Iron Warriors. Locke had seen the pattern 100 times before. This was a layered ambush, a nest of traps.
"Squadrons, pursue with caution," he said. "Beware secondary assaults."
Confirmed,
Lorgus said. He was always so eager to gain Locke's favor. Sickening lick-spittle. Meanwhile, his own quarry wasn't going anywhere. He opened the door at the rear of the driver's compartment and hauled his twisted frame through the cramped innards of the tank, pulling on his power claw, cruelty, and taking up his melter gun, Dragon's Maw. Then he put down the rear ramp, plugged in his weapon's power feeds to his armor ports, and stepped out and around the hull into the panic fire of the heavy bolters. Gunfire of that magnitude would have hurt him once, or even killed him. Now he hardly felt it. He shrugged it off, limping forward with bolt explosions flashing from his armor. Where the rounds left dents in his ceramite, they bled. He took his time to reach his enemy, so eager to feel anything that he lingered to enjoy the hot pain of the bolt rounds. He stepped outside the prow's guns traversal, into the dead spot between it and the sponsons, and the sensation ceased. His body throbbed as it began to heal. A slash of his claw took the muzzle from the prow gun, prompting a series of dull rattles from inside as the bolt in the breech exploded and set off the magazine. One of the sponson guns fell silent also. The other carried on firing, though the bolts passed by harmlessly. Crack, 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 one after the other, their rocket motors ignited, speeding them on. Smoke drifted lazily from the tank's ventilators. Moans of pain sounded from within.
"Prey, moving, my lord,"
came Harvok's growl over the Vox.
2 armor units disabled, closing for the finish. 3 more detected outside the inner net.
outer net secure, prepping to kill,
Gurgled Lorgus.
"Execute,"
Locke said. He had his own kill to enjoy.
Warpsmith,
Lorgus called him.
I have notification from the Ferric Brotherhood. They are under attack by House Kamidar.
Position, Locke replied. He eyed the tank as he spoke. He would peel it open like a mollusk and give the tankers inside the honor of a slow death.
5 miles southwest of the bridge. They are at the limit of their safe operational range, so will probably withdraw soon.
Advisory, Locke said.
If we abandon this hunt now, we could catch them.
"Those were not Lord Tenebrus's orders,"
Harvok interjected. His guns were firing, and his voice broken.
"I am in command here," Locke replied. "I will decide."
On his tactical display, he could see that the slaughter was all but over. His warriors were converging on the last tanks and butchering those that had not made their escape. With a bitter sigh, Locke tuned Dragon's Maw's focal length to the absolute minimum and placed its muzzle on the hull. The corpse dogs would die quickly after all.
"To Khorne, to Nurgle, to Tzeentch, and to Slaanesh, I dedicate this kill," he growled, and fired.
Praying voices turned suddenly to screams as superheated metal vapor boiled within, searing out the crew's lungs and cooking them alive. He let Dragon's Maw scrape over the hull and dropped to his side.
"We go." "We should remain and finish these Phyroxians,"
Harvok said.
4 tanks are escaping, Lord Tenebrus. "Curse Tenebrus," Locke spat. "I am not his slave. All units," he voxed, limping back to Draco Krafki as quickly as his deformed leg would allow. The Imperial tank coughed, its engine block exploded, and the hulk burned behind him. "Abandon pursuit and reform at Point Belferon. The princess is aboard."
Chapter 12. The Pride of Kamidar, the Alpha Target. A meeting promised. Jessivane sent Incender into a charge at the Predator tank, pitching the Knight forward. The fingers of her Thunderstrike gauntlet ripped up trails of lightning from the rockcrete. The Predator waited to fire until her ion shield had passed over its hull, but the shells only clanged off her armor. Her fingers touched ceramite, and she flipped the tank off the ground. She pivoted back, firing her Inferno cannon into the tank's exposed underside. Pressurized fuel blasted the Predator away from her. Flame peeled paint from its hull, its ammo cooked off, and it crashed down ablaze. Then she was past it, heavy stubber gunning after the retreating Heretic Astartes infantry. "A spectacular kill!" Shane voxed her. Heavy footsteps overlaid his voice. Battle cannon shells streaked past Jessivane in paired bursts from her lancemates, detonating amid a squad of enemy heavy weapons troopers. Cultists ran in terror from the rampaging knights. They were well into the vanguard of the traitor force, scattering the infantry supporting the column. "The House Strategos are advising withdrawal. In 20 minutes the traitor fleet will be over the horizon." He paused. His words were replaced by the rising howl of his melter cannon and the roaring of its discharge. "There are targets moving in from the south. Enemy armor. What are your commands?" Jessivane was aware of both. Her Strategos Ultra had been bleating at her to fall back. Coward, she thought, even when he was safe in the sanctum and not out on the field. "The Alpha target," she said. "Perhaps," said Shane, "but we are in no position to engage." There was a vox click as Shane opened a second channel. "Baron Geraint Icamadar, could you please speak with your niece? She's not listening to me." The beginning of Geraint's response was lost to the racket of his Avenger Gatling cannon. "Two ways about it," he said. "The first blade is right. We must withdraw." Jessivane played her Prometheum stream over a crowd of cultists. There were only a few Heretic Astartes. Most were mortal scum who had abandoned the light of the Emperor, and they came in crowds. She slew them gladly. Those that were not blasted to ash scattered like rats into the ruins of cathedrals they had helped destroy. Such faith carelessly abandoned. Such beauty smashed. How she wanted to chase them all down and show them a hotter light than that of faith, to burn them from their holes, to... "Princess," said Shane. "I'm going to withdraw my lance, niece," said Geraint. "It would be better for us all if you gave the order. The Emperor would prefer we follow the proper hierarchy, but I won't let it stop me if you won't." Her eyes strayed to the display showing the closing enemy force. It was bigger than the one they'd smashed their way through, comprised entirely of battle tanks, alert to their presence, and would soon crest the brow of a low ridge southwards. They would get good sighting down the processional leading to the summit, and there was plenty of cover among the ruined chapels there. The fleet was a series of ominous red blobs on another display, approaching a shallow curve, denoting the horizon. It was 10 miles back to the safety of defense laser coverage, 30 back to base. A good run. In the other direction, she could see the macro cathedrum clearly, blotting out the western sky with its marching pinnacles. So close. She snarled in frustration. "House Camadar," she widecast. "The enemy flee, and the battle is done. Turn about and return to the Voidport. We fight another time." She swerved her knight angrily, putting it into a tight turn that threatened to topple it. Her squires raced ahead in their lighter armature knights, but as she came around, she looked to the southwest, down the processional, where she saw a single tank emerge over the brow of the ridge, light winking from its periscopes. She raised her mechanical fist and clenched it, sending out a crackle of energy. She knew it was him. In her bones, she knew it. She disengaged her vox ciphers and broadcast in plain, uncoded Gothic. "We will meet, you and I," she said, "and I will strike you down for the God Emperor." Incendo's swift stride took her across the processional and into the cover of the buildings on the other side, stealing her foe away. "There will be other days and other battles," her uncle assured her. "Praise be to him on Terra that we live to fight again." "Praise be," she said, through gritted teeth. Locke watched the knights cross the processional. The old schema of lines and distance indicators still worked down one side of Draco Kravki's ranging display. The other was patterned with branching veins that pulsed distractingly. The ridge was a low prominence, but Gathalamor Impresentia was largely built on coastal plains, and being away from the great knot of land that heaved up under the spaceport, the ridge's elevation seemed considerable, so he had a fine view of the Imperial war machines withdrawing at a sprint, another of their hit-and-run missions accomplished. They were so heavy, they made the ground shake, even so far away. His targeting sensors bleeped and circled the engine of Princess Jessamine in rotating reticules. He knew her name. She was hardly shy about who she was, but though she did not know his, she had marked him out, and she saw him then. Her ion shield swung to cover the quarter facing Locke's tank. As she raised her fist in challenge, he itched to discharge the laser destroyer. It was ready. Its spirit light shone bright and tempting green. He refrained. The shot was distant. There was plenty of dust in the air. The energy of the beam would be substantially reduced by photon scatter, and then the ion shield of the knight would turn the lust aside.
All I will be doing is showing my impotence, he thought, and the firing light's hope remained unfulfilled.
His Vox crackled. A message on Imperial frequencies. He brought it to the fore with a thought. "We will meet, you and I will strike you down for the God Emperor."
We shall see whose gods are greatest, he said to himself, when we clash machine to machine.
We are advancing obliquely across their path, my lord, Lorgus foxed. We could catch them before they reach the canyon, cut off their route of escape, and allow you to assail them from the rear.
Locke looked to the east, where the ground rose to the spaceport. There was a break in the spires that marked the line of the canyon. The tall piers of St. Cletus Span were visible over the rooftops. As the land dropped further to the north, he could see the sea shining diamonds. It was beautiful, and reminded him of days when his legion aspired to be builders, not destroyers. Weariness tugged at him. Harvok answered before Locke could.
Don't be a fool. They'll kill all of you. Cut right through you. Slag you iron within and iron without. There's more pus than metal in that brain of yours. My lord, Lorgus gurgled.
Let them go, Locke replied. We will hunt them another day and dedicate their deaths to the four in the warp. They are worthy offerings. Our hunt must be done with proper reverence, so our gift is most beneficially received.
Yes, lord.
Lorgus gave a roll of phlegmy laughter. Harvok made a noise of disgust, for he had no truck with the worship of the powers. Locke couldn't understand. Had Perturabo not taken the power of chaos into himself and ascended to demonic glory? There were forms of strength greater than iron. For not seeing it, Harvok was as big a fool as Lorgus in his own fashion. Locke caressed his medallion, the corroded tips of his gauntlet scraping the metal thinner, molecule by molecule, as he watched the last of the knights depart, leaving nothing but dust hanging in the air. Columns of smoke rising, and the ocean in the distance, untroubled by war. Chapter 13. A short trip to Old Hells. The Sleeper. Shadow in Shadows. Kesh peered up the street and winced. Her side hurt still, a week after being hit, even after being given rapid healing gels and the best care. She still didn't think she deserved that. Normally, a soldier would have been off active duty for a month with so serious a wound. Needs must in the Emperor's wars, she thought. Dvorgin was insistent she'd lead the recon mission into the catacombs. At least that was his excuse for getting her such favored treatment. "When do we make our move?" Emmanuel asked. "No offense, Holy Sister, but I think it is better if we go ahead alone here," Kesh said. Her pathfinders pointed their las fusils down the street. With chameleoline cloaks wrapped about them, they were virtually invisible, though Kesh was keen to move on. A single patrol of heretic Astartes or a unit of turncoat guardsmen with decent Auspex gear would be enough to spot them. "Canoness Veritas ordered us to protect you," said Palatine Emmanuel. "You move well in that armor, sister," said Kesh, "but it's not stealth gear. In the tunnels, the quieter we are, and the quicker, the better." "Very well," said Emmanuel. Her swift agreement relieved Kesh. Her armor power plant was humming noisily, so she couldn't disagree. "Thank you, sister. This is your choice of ingress." Emmanuel inclined her helmed head towards the gaping doorless portal of a bombed-out penitent processing center. "Yeah," said Kesh. "Ricard there has been tracking a lot of coming and going that way." Having both her hands occupied with her fusil, she pointed Ricard out with her elbow. "It's a minor entry into the workings, little enough that we can get in unobserved, but not so underused that we won't find any prisoners to take. It's not far from where we took the general." "Which is—" Ricard answered reverentially. 4 processionals over. That way, Blessed One. We shall cover the entrance then, said Emmanuel, noting the direction. Her voice was rendered husky by her helm voxmeter. Just don't do anything heroic, said Kesh. She felt awkward. Emmanuel and her companion were battered by the months-long war. Dust and blood had collected in the cracks of their silver armor, and the plates sported more than a few dents, while their robes were as ragged and filthy as the Mordians' uniforms. But they projected an air of serenity that made Kesh feel inadequate. They were so holy, so pure, just talking to them was awkward. This is my kind of war, all right? I am surprised Mordians employ such tactics. You are not renowned for your stealth. Yes, well, we Pathfinders are not greatly celebrated. You won't find us in the edification pamphlets, Kesh said. She came away from the window and set a dusty chair on its feet, sat down, put aside her fusil, then checked over her bayonet, pistol, respirator, and the small Auspex unit the General had found her. But most people on Mordian grow up sneaking around in the dark, and every army needs someone to gather intelligence. Marching about in brightly colored uniforms and shouting hosannas at the enemy only gets you so far. It gets us quite a long way, said Palatine Emmanuel, mildly. Kesh frowned. Was that a joke? Get ready, she said to her men. Ricard and Dion, you're coming with me. Galatka, stay here. Cover the entrance from this side. Change position every 12 minutes. Got it, said Galatka. Where are you going to put yourselves? Kesh asked Emmanuel, privately hoping it was going to be some way from Galatka. Fear not. We will find a place. The Emperor will conceal us.
Praise him for his mercies, murmured Dion.
Do you know the way? Asked Emmanuel. The maps are incomplete. Yes, said Kesh. We know enough. Don't worry about us. It is my duty to worry about all of Terra's faithful children, said the Palatine. Be careful. We lost several servo skulls mapping this area, and the amount of time they were operative diminished with each one sent. Something was waiting for them in the end. It might be waiting for you. Thank you, sister, said Kesh. Are you sure you do not want us with you? Stealth and thunder. Bad mix. She rapped a knuckle on the sister's thigh plate and instantly regretted her overfamiliarity. Too noisy, she mumbled. There were muted sounds as Ricard and Dion divested themselves of their fusils. They would have no use for sniper rifles down in the dark. All of them snapped stab lights to the tops of their pistols. Then they touched up the night black on each other's faces. Dion folded up his cap and stowed it. Ricard and Kesh had put theirs away earlier, Kesh rolling hers up and tucking it into her epaulette, as was her custom. "Could you bless us, sister?" asked Ricard. Emmanuel looked to Kesh. "Please," Kesh said. Galatka kept watch as the three of them knelt before Emmanuel, crossed their arms in the aquila, and bowed their heads. Kesh's eyes fixed on the head of the flanged power mace dangling by Emmanuel's calf. Emmanuel gave them a quick blessing, commending their souls to the Emperor in case they should fall. It was the usual mantra of service to mankind and its maker, but coming from Sister Emmanuel, it felt more potent somehow than when Preacher Scavacus had recited the words. He was dead now, of course, like so many others. "For him on Terra," Emmanuel finished. "For him on Terra," said the Mordian scouts. Kesh looked to Dion and Ricard. Bright white eyes shone out of sooty faces. "Are you ready?" she said. They nodded. Galatka lifted her right hand up and made a circle of affirmation with her thumb and forefinger, though she kept her rifle trained on the street. "Then move out." They swept across the street, sticking close to cover. Ricard and Dion went into the building first, their las pistols drawn. Kesh risked a glance back. She couldn't see either Galatka or the Battle Sisters, but she gave a quick salute before going after. The Auspex slapped uncomfortably against her leg. A path had been cleared through the detritus. Dotted about were signs of people, scraps of cloth and discarded ration packs in the main, but Kesh paused over a patch of blood, soaked black into the dust. They moved on, footfalls barely audible, towards a stairway at the back. The building had suffered a fire, and the rooms within were scorched, making it dark. Ricard held up his hand, drew his gun, and peered down the steps, las pistol steady in both hands. "Clear," he signed, and they pushed on into the first sub-level. Another set of stairs, then another, and in a pillared cellar they reached the entrance to the workings. It looked like the door giving access to Gathalamor's endless underworld had been removed and the portal hacked into a wide, round maw studded with rebar teeth. There were piles of bones beneath the dripping bricks of the cellar vaulting. They'd been sorted from the rubble meticulously, which made Kesh uneasy. Emperor alone knew why. Though she was down there to find out things like that, part of her had hoped she wouldn't. "Scout, observe, then withdraw," she said to her men. They all had their guns out now. Dion took out his bayonet, swapping his las pistol to his left hand so he could hold his blade in his right. Ricard left his bayonet sheathed. He favored a two-handed grip on his gun. Dion covered the cellar entrance. Ricard knelt by the hole in the wall, peering into the darkness of the catacombs. There was no illumination, so they were going to need their stab lights, a situation Kesh had wanted to avoid. She took out the Auspex and activated it. Its tones were switched off and screen muted to combat low, but still the light it gave out made her uneasy. Fearing its emanations might be detected, she selected a short scan pulse. Nothing living appeared on the cartograph. Orange lines in some corridors were power feeds, lumens were splotches. Air currents played as ethereal patterns. But no life, no movement. "Go, go," she said. "Light on, Ricard. We'll follow your lead." Ricard's lumen beam stabbed into the dark, lighting a cone of the tunnel starkly. He moved off at a steady walk, sweeping his light back and forth. The catacombs went on forever, as far as Kesh could tell. Each one had its own character. Throne, she thought. Each level of each catacomb had its own character, and yet they somehow contrived to seem all the same. Here the dead were stood upright, lining each side of the corridor, facing forward in a macabre recreation of a parade. The air was dry, and the corpses were desiccated, so that most of them were held together with rock-hard sinew beneath their fragile costumes. She'd have expected the heads to fall free at least, but as Ricard's light swept over them, she glimpsed rusty wires holding limbs in place, and once seen, she noticed more. Someone had been down there, repairing the dead. Judging by the thick layer of dust around the corpses, that had been centuries ago. They came to a junction. Ricard stopped. Again, Kesh pulsed the Auspex. Its dim screen seemed dazzling in the dark. "Clear," she said. "No life signs." They went on, stopping at every junction, ears straining as Kesh ran a scan. The unit had a good part of the catacombs there preloaded, enough for them to head with confidence towards the dig site she'd shown Dvorgin last week. But the edges led off into unknown tunnels the skulls had failed to map. Emmanuel's words came back to her. "It might be waiting for you." "Nothing," Kesh said over and over again, until... "Wait, I have something." Ricard snapped off his light and looked about. Mordian eyes were sharp in the dark, and there were a few lumens strung down that particular tunnel, giving them enough to see by. "How many?" "One. Weak life sign." "Injured?" asked Dion. Kesh tuned the Auspex to a sharper reading. "No," she said. "Sleeping."
"Wake up, traitor scum," said
Ricard. He poked the sleeper in the ribs with his gun and stepped back quickly from the niche she occupied. The skeleton that had lain there was in pieces on the floor, its bones replaced by a warm body. She looked like a bundle of rags until she turned over, and the Mordian saw she was a woman, not old but prematurely aged by a brutal life. Few teeth, dirt caked into every line on her face, eyes red with corpse dust. She held up her hands. "Notodon," she said. She was wild, blinded by the stab lights and afraid. "Lone slept at Nini Motan, be kinder." She scrambled out of the niche, scattering bones. She threw herself onto the floor and pressed her face into the dirt. "Bester itajan, hardly andan, more fromi worku, be kinder." She fell into an incomprehensible jabber. What words they could pick out were jumbled and heavily accented. "Yes to 4 great honest, all restly andan. Forgiven it I, beggin I, not to be tartan, not to killaten andan." "Gathalect," said Kesh in disgust. They'd heard it plenty, mostly among the traitors. Always it was the poor who heard the call of chaos loudest. "You are lucky," said Ricard slowly to her. "We're not your masters." He hauled her up, wrinkling his nose at her smell. The woman stank of something worse than poor hygiene. She was weak. Dion had no trouble grabbing her wrists and binding her hands behind her back with plastic detention bracelets. Gag her before she works out what's going on, said Kesh. The woman's struggles were easily dealt with. Dion stuffed a rag into her mouth and tied it in place. They had no muzzles with them. Supplies of everything at base were low. They'd been lucky to get the cuffs. Stablight, said Kesh. Ricard shone his into the face of the woman, which had the benefit, from Kesh's point of view, of levelling her pistol at her eye. Listen to me, Kesh said slowly. The higher classes of Gathalamor spoke standard Low Gothic, and most of the population understood it. We will not hurt you if you come quietly. If you don't, you'll wish your masters had found you sleeping. The woman seemed to take a moment to process Kesh's words. Then she nodded frantically and moaned. Tears streaked her dusty face. She was trying to speak through the cloth. Quiet! Kesh nodded to her men. She looked about uneasily. They should go deeper, but something wasn't right. The woman wasn't much of a prisoner, but she was all the excuse Kesh needed to leave. We're leaving, Kesh said. Right then, back up we go, said Ricard, shoving the woman forward. We should be quick. Finding this is a stroke of luck. Luck never holds, said Dion, and spat in the dirt. Kesh used the auspex again. Seeing nothing, she followed her men. From a dark spot close to the edge where the map ran out, Kesh watched the tunnel with growing worry. Quiet when they entered, now a work gang was coming down from the surface in double files. Overseers in cured leather masks watched, electro-whips coiled in their hands. Small teams were setting up arc lumens. Shit, said Kesh. She slipped away, back into the junction. I told you luck never holds, said Dion glumly. What about that way? Said Ricard. He nodded down the main tunnel, away from the work gang. No, it's not mapped, and it smells deep, said Kesh. It did. A draft carried chill, musty air up to them. It's away from the enemy. We could find another way out once we've got a bit of space between us and them, argued Ricard. Kesh shook her head. We stick to the mapped area. If we get lost down here, we'll never get out. These tunnels add up to thousands of miles. The noise of the work gang covered their voices. Ricard had their prisoner face down, his pistol pressed into the nape of her neck. Dion watched the side tunnel entrance. Maybe they'll move on by, said Kesh. Then we can slip past and get back out the way we came in. Dion leaned forward. I don't think so. What makes you... Shh, Dion said. Listen. The clatter of tools came to them. They've started digging here. Ricard cocked his head. Those aren't tools. Too hollow-sounding. He looked at his comrades. Bones? He said, as he craned his neck to see. They're throwing the corpses onto the floor and picking up the bones. Kesh glanced back down the side tunnel. We'll take this one instead. It looks like it runs parallel to the basements on this street. Not mapped either, though, said Ricard. No, it's not mapped either, said Kesh harshly. But that's the way we're going. Ricard hauled the prisoner to her feet. They vanished into the shadows. Within 20 minutes, they were hopelessly lost. We're going down, Dion said. The air's getting warmer. Kesh checked the Auspex thermoregister. It was possible to gauge their depth by temperature. It was cool underground to begin with, then as one got deeper, the temperature climbed until it became unbearably hot. She couldn't tell exactly how far underground they were, but Dion was right. They were descending. We're not too far down, she said, truthfully. It's not that warm. We should be out soon. That was a lie. She had no idea where they were. They stopped at a junction, as they had at all the others. She let out an Auspex pulse. The return came quickly, sketching in the three-dimensional maze of catacombs and adding it to the machine's store of data. Where the pulse gave out, all ended in blackness, so Kesh twisted a knob and moved the display back to the areas mapped by the Battle Sisters' servo skulls. There was a gap of several hundred feet between their current position and the nearest known area. Not too far at all, and there were no signs of life or of movement between. I think we've got a way out, she said. She pointed down a black tunnel. That way. Dion and Ricard went ahead. Dion in the lead with his stablight on, Ricard with the prisoner behind. The darkness seemed particularly thick, the light of the lumen a hard circle that trapped the bones in the walls. Dion suddenly stopped. Did you hear that? They listened. Kesh heard nothing, but felt a stirring of air move across her. Hairs on her neck prickled. "There was nothing on the auspex?" Dion asked. "I'm going to check again," she said. She let out a pulse. Energetic particles soaked their surroundings, their delayed return giving the data. Half a second passed, and the screen filled with information. The same tunnels, the same distance to known halls, and no. "Wait," she said. A red mark flared in a position on the map behind them. "I've got something." She looked up. Dion, Ricard, and the prisoner were chiaroscuro studies. They could have been oils from the Umbral School on Mordian. She glanced back down. The dot and the map was fading out. She put the auspex to constant scan, a power-hungry and easily detectable setting. The catacomb walls filled in more firmly. The red dot reappeared in another corridor beneath them. She slapped the auspex with her hand. "That's impossible," she said. "What?" said Ricard. "It's like it just sank through the floor." "Maybe there's a hole," said Dion. There were no holes. "Get moving, quickly now," said Kesh. They began to jog. A hiss sounded in the darkness, far too well formed to be anything but a voice. She looked at the screen. Its light shone over the tunnel walls and the bones inside their niches, lending them an eerie glow. The red dot vanished and reappeared in a passage on their left now, and was closing. "Faster," she said. "Take the next right." Ricard swore at the prisoner as he forced her to move. She was weeping around her gag. Dion snapped his stab light around, getting nervy. The pounding of their footsteps changed as they went into a large chamber. Dion's stab light danced over crumbling angels and faceless saints. Long frills of calcium leached from the buildings of the city, engulfed tombs and carved screens. "Which way?" he said. He panned the light around, passing it over a wall where 1,000 skulls stared out of circular holes. The beam glared suddenly as it crossed a spur foundation of a building, driven thoughtlessly through the chapel. 3 exits greeted them on the other side of that. Kesh looked at the screen. The dot had vanished. "Which way, Sergeant?" Dion said. He half-turned, shifting his light. "That way, the middle one," she said, trying to stop her voice shaking. "It should go up. It's not far." "Thank the throne for that," said Dion. "This place is seriously giving me the fear." He turned again. His stab light caught something, floating right in front of him. Kesh only got a glimpse. She had an impression of a collection of heaving rags in vaguely man-shaped form, like a phantom with a skull for a face, its eyes covered over with a collection of brass-bound lenses. Something moved out from the rags. Dion's head flew free of his shoulders. A jet of hot blood washed over Kesh's face as he fell. His stab light hit the ground and went out. The prisoner screamed. "Run!" shouted Kesh. Ricard let out an oath no Emperor-fearing Mordian should ever voice. Kesh felt something move past her and ducked. A blade hissed close by her face. Ricard's light came on. She chanced her own. 2 shafts of brilliance lanced the gloom. The shape darted through both, daring them to fire. Ricard did, the crack of his las pistol loud in the chapel. A flick of blue light stamped a glowing hole into the stone, but the shape weaved by, swift as a fish in the water. It veered around them and vanished behind. The auspex clicked frantically. The device was still locked into stealth mode, and the sounds were ever so small, but they were so many that they needed Kesh's hearing as they grew closer together, warning of growing proximity. They reached the exit, fearing a blade in the back every step of the way. She'd have preferred a tighter tunnel, one where the thing couldn't get past, but it was tall and wide, a major thoroughfare once, perhaps, though it had been truncated by a wall of crumbling plascrete blocks only 100 yards away. There was a gap in the bottom, a human-sized version of the holes used by house vermin. "That's what we are," she thought. "Vermin in the tombs of saints." "Get ahead, sir! Get her out!" Ricard said. Kesh hooked the prisoner under the elbow and dragged her on. Ricard stood his ground, his gun up. Kesh shoved the moaning woman towards the hole in the wall. The prisoner sprawled, unable to get through. Kesh was cursing and taking out her knife to cut her hands free when she heard Ricard open fire. She looked back. Blue flashes and the cone of his stab light chased the shadow around the tunnel, but it looped and dived, screeching a perverse mix of animal howls and binaric. Was it some kind of servitor? Ricard hit it precisely never. Glowing impact marks shone all over the tunnel. The thing had vanished, and Ricard was chasing shadows with his beam. The prisoner was whining something. Kesh shoved the woman out of the way and bent down, shining her stab light into the hole. There was another layer of blocks behind the first, these whole. They were trapped. She stood, gun out. The auspex was silent. "Has it gone?" she shouted now. With all the crackle of gunfire and the things wailing, anybody nearby would have heard. The alert would be going up. If that thing didn't get them first, something else would. "I don't know," said Ricard. "Stay back, sir." He sounded scared. Ricard was never scared. The thing hadn't gone. It was as if it was waiting for Ricard to show his fear before it dropped down from the ceiling, maybe through the ceiling, and engulfed him. Flapping strands of shiny cloth wrapped about his head and constricted. Whipping metal tentacles, each tipped with a cruel blade, flashed in Kesh's lumen light. The thing's head turned around to regard her, even while Ricard tore at the rags, his screams muffled. Soulless lenses glared in the dark. The rags twitched hard, snapping Ricard's neck. Blades sliced down, ripping his arms from his body. By then, Kesh was firing. The shadow shape unwound itself into the strobe of lasfire. Kesh was sure she had it lying dead in her sights, but every shot seemed to go wide. It rose up, seeming to grow. One shot punched a hole in the rags, but it was closed by more pulsing shadow, and it rushed at her, fleshless jaw open in a howl. Kesh howled back. The thunder of bolt gun fire had her diving for the floor. Rocket flare lit up the tunnel. The shadow was caught in a crossfire between two weapons either side of the entrance. These did not miss. The bolts were swallowed by the shadowy mass, and many did not detonate, but enough were tripped to end the thing. It was torn apart in a flurry of micro-explosions and fell to the floor with a wet slap. It hissed slowly, though it had no mouth nor any mechanical apparatus of speech to make so human a sound. The skull lay still at the head of the rag pile, a metallic spine poking through cloth. Like that, it seemed no menace, a thing of little mass, too light to hurt anyone. The eye lenses were out. Sparks puttered from a whirring mechanism. It was clearly dead, but Kesh kept her las pistol pointed at its head, just the same. Her side throbbed. In her exertions, she'd torn her stitches. Palatine Emmanuel and the other battle sister approached. Kesh had been right about one thing. Power armor made a racket in those confined spaces. "How did you find us?" Kesh asked. "The Emperor is our guide," said the Palatine. She towed the thing. "What is it? A servitor?" "Mechanismus diabolus," said Emmanuel. "A demon machine. I've never seen one so small, but that is what it is. A creature of the warp, clad in technology and stolen flesh." Kesh had heard the stories of warp Xenos. They all had, since the rift opened. She felt like vomiting, just being near the thing. "Are there more?" "Perhaps," said Palatine Emmanuel. She looked past Kesh. "You have a prisoner. Then your mission is a success." Kesh looked at the dead thing again. Noisome vapors were beginning to spew from the mouth. Her desire to vomit grew. "The animus is leaving its shell," said Emmanuel. "I suggest we exit quickly before it tries to make a home in us." Chapter 14. The Apostate's Tomb. Sarcophagus. A Cardinal's Legacy. Tharador Yeng had chosen a grand portico as the place to greet her master. The saints, clustered around the top of the columns, had been ritually desecrated for him. She herself had chiseled off the first barred imperial eye before letting her minions loose on it with their tools. They had been thorough and imaginative. Real severed heads replaced those of decapitated statues. A fresh tableau made of the tormented dead had been set up near the entrance, the bodies arranged on wire armatures and, where necessary, stitched together to create a rotting glory where craven imperial priests gave praise to the true gods. Other holy displays were arrayed about the square entrance, and the road beyond was lined with soldiers impaled upon metal spikes and pierced with shards of glass. The marble paving cracked into powder under the weight of Kargathar's ancient rhino. It was black and maroon, the color of the masters, the true masters, they who spoke with the voices of the gods, not the dour unbelievers of Perturabo. Its hull crawled with holy scriptures, making its surface seethe. She wished she could read it, but she could not. It was the language of the warp, beyond her ability to decipher, and it hurt her to try. The day would come when the scales would fall from her eyes, and the words would read clear. She had been promised as much by the whispers in the night. Her discovery would bring that gift, she was sure, and she smiled. Her followers grovelled in a half-circle, arms outstretched and faces to the floor. They whimpered where bits of debris cut at them, but none dared move. Their pain was agreeable to her. She herself was dressed to impress the master. She wore a clinging black gown that plunged to her navel, showing off new links forced through her flesh down the centre of her chest. The piercings had been painful, but she took it as a sign of the god's favour that the flesh had closed up immediately. Barely a drop of blood spilled, she marvelled. In her hand she carried a staff whose forked top gave out a constant blue fire. The night the power had come to her had been terrifying, yet ecstatic. A whisper on the breeze, a breath on her face, and new understanding bloomed in her. It was only a few days ago, but she clung to the memory for fear it would fade. The fire gave off a cool heat, but she could, she thought, immolate one of her servants with it, if she wished. She was tempted to try. The rhino came to a clanking halt in front of her, its engine growling like a monster set free from ancient hells. The side door opened, and Kargathar stepped out in curls of scented smoke, his cloak of shadows writhing around him. He looked around the square and grunted, unimpressed, but when he looked at Yang, his eyes lingered on her flaming staff.
"Your powers grow," he said. "Such sweet puissance you display. So charming."
"A gift for my discovery," she said.
"Careful now. You might have found it.
The flame's reflection danced in his eye lenses.
Or you might only believe you have."
"I have, for I have already been rewarded."
The cold fires flared higher. Kargathar's chuckle came out of his fanged helm as a growl.
"You know very little still. The gods may be testing you. They enjoy tripping the prideful."
She dared be bold then.
"You believe it too, or else you would not have come."
When no word of killing magic or gunshot came in answer to her insolence, she gestured at the portico, and the bronze doors ruptured onto blackness.
"If you will follow, my lord, I will show you the way."
"We will see if you are right about this," said Kargathar. "I enjoy my acolytes' failures as much as I like their successes."
"The dark gods willing, my lord, you will have the latter pleasure,"
she said with a tilt of her head. It was here. She had found it. She knew it. Sending for Kargathar would have been suicidal otherwise.
"It is not too far, a little way, but it is deep."
"Then lead on, Tharador Yang," he said.
Tharador went under the portico to the doors. Bright metal shone through verdigris where her servants had cut and bashed them in. She passed into a cool gloom, the master's heavy tread at her heels. Kargathar's armour sighed as if with pleasure as he stepped underground. They proceeded 100 yards down a well-kept corridor, then took a side door. These upper levels had been in use until the invasion. Further in, there were tangles of bodies where pilgrims had died, but the way they were going went much farther under the earth. Behind the door, a set of rough-hewn steps led relentlessly downwards. Kargathar sniffed the air. His voxmeter amplified the sound into something animalistic.
"I smell damp and rot. Salt," he said.
"The sea is close," said Yang. "These tunnels go out underneath it eventually. Somewhere they have been breached, and the ocean has intruded under the city."
As they descended, the witch-light of her staff danced from the walls.
"Do we venture past the boundary of earth and water?" Kargathar answered.
"The tomb is at the edge," she said. "Stone and salt, water and earth. Always the greatest power is concentrated in liminal places."
"It is so," he replied, approvingly.
The stairs were dead straight and narrow, and the stone damp. Kargathar's pauldron scraped a pattering of sand from the walls. His feet crushed steps into dirt.
"The deeper one ventures into the catacombs, the more ancient they become," she said. "Some have been places of pilgrimage for thousands of years, but deep enough, and the catacombs become a place of slow forgetting and decay. No saint lasts forever. Even the most beloved martyr falls out of favor.
I have seen the most glorious monuments down here, buried in the filth of ages, the saints they celebrated anonymous, another illusion of the Imperium's permanence.
Our gods are eternal, said Kargathar. To be their servant is to never be forgotten. To die in their name is to join them in the warp, serve them, and see how the faithful are rewarded.
His voice boomed. The dark and the echoes gave the sense that the steps went down forever.
Or fail, he added, and no damnation. It is all the same to them.
I will not fail, Yang said, and led him onward. She was proud that she and her followers had been sent deepest of all, down through collapsed stairwells and compacted layers of bone. Day after day they had toiled with machines, hand tools, and when they had to, bloodied fingers. Down they had dug, through grottos of marble and iron, where discarded offerings to discarded saints lay in mouldering heaps. They had dug through layers of glass many feet deep, the glare of their arc lights creating unsettling motion in the depths. Faces swam there, the eyes of figures peered from vitrified purgatory. They had dug through stone, and sand, and death. Through all the hardships, Tharador had driven her followers on, allowing the weak to perish and the strong to prevail. Her own gifts had grown as she drew closer to their prize. This place had been the making of her. Now she would become its mistress. She led the master off the steps into a broad tunnel roofed with weeping rock and floored with earth. She had ordered all work to cease, out of respect for him, and they passed dig teams who knelt silently in the shadows. Handcarts waited to be pushed upwards, loaded with carefully selected bones, dragged from their repose. "You are eager," she thought of Kargathar. "Lord Tenebrous bade you hasten us." She would not have dared to voice the thought. She did not want to die. She knew Kargathar did not like to acknowledge Tenebrous's seniority, and took pains to conceal it in front of their cult minions.